Before the 1950s, queer identities and behaviors were often pathologized and criminalized. This happened all over the US, and Michigan was no exception. In 1846, Michigan officially outlawed sodomy as a crime against nature. In 1903, Michigan took a step further by also outlawing gross indecency between men. Gross indecency between women was outlawed in 1939. In addition to the legislative and medical discrimination, queer people faced harassment from their own families and from law enforcement, who repeatedly attempted to suppress the growing queer cultural scene. So far, this may all sound a bit grim, and although it's true that queer people lacked legal rights at this time, there was also considerable growth happening in the community. The period before the 1950s saw the creation of many queer-centered bars and establishments, which served as a platform for queer entertainers and a refuge for queer people to socialize. Michigan also became audience to several very famous speakers, such as Oscar Wilde in 1882 and Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas in 1934. In the 1950s, queer culture continued to grow. There was a strong drag scene in Detroit, led by people of color. Establishments serving a queer clientele continued to grow, and queer publications, such as One and The Ladder, began to gain readership in Michigan. In 1958, Hal Lawson, David Brewer, and Jay Moore established a chapter of the Mattachine Society in Detroit. The struggles also continued for queer people during this time. They faced discrimination in employment and fear of arrest as sex offenders. Tensions with the police also continued in 1959. A Detroit cop was stabbed while attempting to arrest a man on a morals charge. Unfortunately, the 1960s began as a dark time for queer people in Michigan. In 1960, the Detroit Mattachine disbanded, a loss for those who'd felt safer with the presence of a homosexual organization in Detroit. Hate crimes and suicide were notable during this period as universities and law enforcement attempted to crack down on homosexual activity. In 1964, police conducted a raid on a gay after-hours club in Flint. Both Wayne State University and Michigan State University put forth measures to deter and catch homosexual activities in bathrooms. In 1967, Wayne State, which had attempted to conceal cameras in the restrooms, finally agreed to destroy files on suspected homosexuals. This being said, the growth of gay establishments and publications in Michigan continued during this time. Dialogues about homosexuality also began to arise. In 1969, the Metropolitan Detroit Council of Churches and One came together to co-sponsor a forum on homosexuality. Queer activism really took off in the 1970s. The Gay Liberation Front, a significantly less moderate activist group, formed a branch in Detroit, and then went on to become registered as student groups at Michigan University in 1970 and Wayne State University in 1971. The Gay Liberation Front was denied access to University of Michigan buildings. However, in 1971, Gail Rubin formed a group called Radical Lesbians at the University of Michigan. During this decade, many legal arguments and discussions about legal protections for gay and lesbian individuals began to gain momentum. The number of queer organizations, community centers, and publications began to grow. However, violence and opposition towards the gay community was still prevalent. Police continued to arrest queer individuals for public indecency. Many of these arrests took place in restrooms. In 1976, the first Michigan Women's Music Festival was held in Hesperia, and in 1979, many traveled to the capital to participate in the National March on Washington for gay and lesbian rights. The 1980s saw a continuation of growth in organizations led by and supporting queer people. However, it also saw a continuation of violence and arrests for solicitation. In 1981, the Michigan Department of Health reported the state's first 2 deaths from AIDS. The trans community began to finally get some visibility, as the first Michigan Transgender Conference was held near Saugatuck. Lansing also made progress by giving their police force gay and lesbian awareness training. However, overall police violence in the state continued, as did hate crimes and threats against the queer community. Some protections for gay and lesbian individuals began to be recognized. However, this did not stop the discrimination or the problems of the AIDS crisis, which had been designated as a handicap. Several groups and supportive events was created for those living with the disease, such as the AIDS Care Connection in Detroit. In the 1990s, ACT UP began making appearances in Michigan. Its first chapter formed in Ann Arbor in 1990. Resources and community for men of color with AIDS also appeared, giving much needed support to a demographic that had been heavily affected by the AIDS epidemic. Legal protections for gays and lesbians increased, however, many still opposed these protections. Arrests for gross indecency continued. The number of AIDS deaths passed 10,000, and outrage over increasing queer visibility became common. Still, in many ways at this point, it seemed like things were beginning to look up for the queer community in Michigan. However, in 1991, the Michigan Women's Festival kicked out an attendee whom they suspected was transgender. This was indicative of a strong tension between the lesbian and transgender communities. Much of this conflict centered around the Michigan Women's Festival, or MishFest, and prompted the creation of Camp Trans in 1991. Camp Trans, a group who gathered outside of MishFest to protest the festival's Women Born Women policy. In 1994, the protesters at Camp Trans entered MishFest with the support of the Lesbian Avengers, a radical group within MishFest, and, once inside, author and activist Leslie Feinberg spoke to the crowd about the unfairness of MishFest's policy, and for one night, the women from Camp Trans were welcome in MishFest. This, however, did not last, and the Women Born Women policy continued to be a point of contention at the festival until its end in 2015.